Section 38 of the Endeavour Journal of Sir Joseph Banks. Journal from 25 August 1768 to 12 July 1771 by Joseph Banks. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Gail Timmerman Vaughan. Section 38. May 1770, Part 2. 1770, May 21. Land seen only from the masthead. Innumerable boobies, for near 2 hours before and after sunrise, flew by the ship, coming from north-northwest and flying south-southeast. I suppose from some bird island in that direction where they roosted last night. At 9, new land was in sight, the other side of the bay, which we left last night. As we approached it, the depth of water gradually decreased to 9 fathom. At 4 in the evening, the land appeared very low, but covered with fine wood. On it were very many large smokes, several of which were seen before we could see the land itself. At night, water still shoal, land low and well wooded, fertile to appearance as anything we have seen upon this coast. At 8, came to an anchor till morn. 1770, May 22. In the course of the night the tide rose very considerably. In the morn we got under sail again. The land, as last night, fertile and well wooded. At noon the land appeared much less fertile. Near the beach it was sandy, and we plainly saw with our glasses that it was covered with palm nut trees, Pandanus tectorius, which we had not seen since we left the islands within the tropics. Along shore we saw 2 men walking along, who took no notice of us. At night we were working into a bay, in which seemed to be good anchorage, where we came to an anchor, resolved to go ashore tomorrow, and examine a little the produce of the country. 1770, May 23. Wind blew fresh off the land, so cold that our cloaks were very necessary in going ashore. As the ship lay a good way from the land, we were some time before we got there. When landed, however, the sun recovered its influence and made it sufficiently hot, in the afternoon almost intolerably so. We landed near the mouth of a large lagoon, which ran a good way into the country, and sent out a strong tide. Here we found a great variety of plants, several, however, the same as those we ourselves had before seen in the islands between the tropics, and others known to be natives of the East Indies, a sure mark that we were upon the point of leaving the southern temperate zone, and for the future we must expect to meet with plants, etc., a part of which at least have been seen before by Europeans. The soil in general was very sandy and dry, though it produced a large variety of plants, yet it never was covered with a thick verdure. Fresh water we saw none, but several swamps and bogs of salt water. In these, and upon the sides of the lagoon, grew many mangrove trees, in the branches of which were many nests of ants, one sort of which were quite green. These, when the branches were disturbed, came out in large numbers, and revenged themselves very sufficiently upon their disturbers, biting sharper than any I have felt in Europe. The mangroves had also another trap, which most of us fell into, a small kind of caterpillar, green and beset with many hairs. These sat upon the leaves many together, ranged by the side of each other like soldiers drawn up, 20 or 30 perhaps, upon one leaf. If these wrathful militia were touched but ever so gently, they did not fail to make the person offending them sensible of their anger, every hair in them stinging much as nettles do, but with a more acute though less lasting smart. Upon the sides of the hills were many of the trees yielding a gum like Sanguis draconis. They differed, however, from those seen in the last harbour, in having their leaves longer and hanging down, like those of the weeping willow, though notwithstanding that, I believe that they were of the same species. There was, however, much less gum upon them. Only one tree that I saw had any upon it, contrary to all theory, which teaches that the hotter a climate is, the more gums exude. The same observation, however, held good in the plant yielding the yellow gum, of which, though we saw vast numbers, we did not see any that showed signs of gum. On the shoals and sandbanks near the shore of the bay were many large birds, far larger than swans, which we judged to be pelicans, but they were so shy that we could not get within gunshot of them. On the shore were many birds, one species of bustard, of which we shot a single bird, as large as a good turkey. The sea seemed to abound in fish, but unfortunately, at the first haul, we tore our seine to pieces. On the mud banks under the mangrove trees were innumerable oysters, hammer oysters, and many more sorts, among which were a large proportion of small pearl oysters. Whether the sea in deeper water might abound with as great a proportion of full-grown ones, we had not an opportunity to examine, but if it did, a pearl fishery here must turn out to immense advantage. Those who stayed on board the ship saw about 20 of the natives, who came down abreast of the ship and stood upon the beach for some time looking at her, after which they went into the woods. We on shore saw none. Many large fires were made at a distance from us, where probably the people were. One small one was in our neighbourhood. To this we went. It was burning when we came to it, but the people were gone. Near it was left several vessels of bark, which we conceived were intended for water buckets, several shells and fish bones, the remainder, I suppose, of their last meal. Near the fires, for there were 6 or 7 small ones, were as many pieces of soft bark, of about the length and breadth of a man. These we supposed to be their beds. On the windward side of the fires was a small shade of about a foot high, made of bark likewise. The whole was in a thicket of close trees, defended by them from the wind. Whether it was really or not the place of their abode we can only guess. We saw no signs of a house, or anything like the ruins of an old one, and from the ground being much trod, we concluded that they had for some time remained in that place. 1770 May 24. At daybreak we went to sea. The weather was fine. We, however, were too far from the land to distinguish anything but that there were some fires upon it, though not many. At dinner we ate the bustard we had shot yesterday. It turned out an excellent bird, far the best, we all agree, that we have eat since we left England. And as it weighed 15 pounds, our dinner was not only good, but plentiful. In the evening it dropped calm, and we caught some fish, though not many. 1770 May 25. Land in the Mourne rocky, varied here and there with reddish sand, but little wood was to be seen. In the evening it was calm. Some few fish were caught. At night, perceiving the tide to run very strong, we anchored. No fires were seen the whole day. We examined the orange juice and brandy, which had been sent on board as prepared by Dr. Hume's directions. See his letter, page 291. It had never been moved from the keg in which it came on board. About 1/2 of it had been used or leaked out. The remainder was covered with a whitish mother, but otherwise was not at all damaged, either to taste or sight, when it came out of the keg. But when put into a bottle, in 3 or 4 days it became ropey and good for nothing. On this we resolved to have it evaporated immediately to a strong essence, and put up in bottles immediately. 1770 May 26. Standing into a channel with land on both sides of us, and water very shoal. Many rocky islets, the main land very rocky and barren. At one the water became so shallow that we came to an anchor. While the ship's boats were employed in sounding round about her, myself and my small boat went a-shooting, and killed several boobies, and a kind of white bird, called by the seamen egg bird, sterna . Before I went out, we tried in the cabin to fish with hook and line, but the water was too shoal, 3 fathoms, for any fish. The swamp was, however, in some degree supplied by crabs, of which vast numbers were on the ground, who readily took our baits, and sometimes held them so fast with their claws that they suffered themselves to be hauled into the ship. They were of 2 sorts, Cancer pelagicus Linn, and another, much like the former but not so beautiful. The first was ornamented with the finest ultramarine blue conceivable, with which all his claws and every joint was deeply tinged. The under part of him was a lovely white, shining as if glazed, and perfectly resembling the white of old china. The other had a little of the ultramarine on his joints and toes, and on his back 3 very remarkable brown spots. 2 fires were seen upon an island, and those who went to sound in the boats saw people upon an island, who also called to them, and seemed very desirous that they should land. In imagining a fig which we had found at our last going ashore, we found in the fruit of it a synops, very like, if not exactly the same species, with Synops sycamori Linn, described by Hazelquist in his Iter Palestinum. A strong proof of the fact that figs must be impregnated by means of insects, though indeed that fact wanted not any additional proofs. 1770 May 27. The boats, who sounded yesterday, Having brought back word that there was no passage ahead of the ship, we were obliged to return, which we did, and soon fell in with the mainland again, which was barren to appearance. On it were some smokes. We passed by many islands. In the eve the breeze was stronger than usual with cloudy weather. 1770 May 28. This morn at daybreak the water appeared much discoloured, as if we had passed by some place where a river ran into the sea. The land itself was high, and abounded with hills. Soon after we came round a point into a bay in which were a multitude of islands. We stood into the middle of them. A boat was sent ahead to sound and made a signal for a shoal, on which the ship came to, but before the anchor went she had less than 3 fathom water. The boats now sounded all round her, and found that she was upon the shoalest part, on which the anchor was got up and we stood on. Weather was hazy. At night anchored. 1770 May 29. Early this morn we got up our anchor, and stood in for an opening, in which by 9 o'clock we came to an anchor. We saw in coming in no signs of people. After breakfast we went ashore, and found several plants, which we had not before seen. Among them were, however, still more East Indian plants than at the last harbour. One kind of grass, which we had also seen there, was very troublesome to us. Its sharp seeds were bearded backwards, and whenever they stuck into our clothes, were by these beards pushed forward till they got into the flesh. This grass was so plentiful that it was hardly possible to avoid it, and with the mosquitoes, that were likewise innumerable, made walking almost intolerable. We were not, however, to be repulsed, but proceeded into the country. The gum trees were like those in the last bay, both in leaf, and producing a very small proportion of gum. On the branches of them and other trees were large ants' nests made of clay, as big as a bushel, something like to those described in Sir Hans Sloane's History of Jamaica, Volume 2, page 211, t. 258, but not so smooth. The ants also were small, and had whitish abdomens. In another species of tree, Xanthoxyloides mite, a small sort of black ants had bored all the twigs, and lived in quantities in the hollow part, where the pith should be, the tree nevertheless flourishing, bearing leaves and flowers upon those very branches, as freely and well as upon others that were sound. Insects in general were plentiful, butterflies especially. Of one sort of these, much like P. similis Linn., the air was for the space of 3 or 4 acres crowded with them to a wonderful degree. The eye could not be turned in any direction without seeing millions, and yet every branch and twig was almost covered with those that sat still. Of these we took as many as we chose, knocking them down with our caps, or anything that came to hand. On the leaves of the gum tree we found a pupa or chrysalis, which shone almost all over as bright as if it had been silvered over with a most burnished silver, and perfectly resembled silver. It was brought on board, and the next day came out into a butterfly of a velvet black, changeable to blue. His wings, both upper and under, marked near the edges with many light brimstone-coloured spots, those of his underwings being indented deeply at each end. We saw no fresh water, but several swamps of salt, overgrown with mangroves. In these we found some species of shells, among them Trochus perspectivus Linn. Here was also a very singular phenomenon in a small fish, of which there was great abundance. It was about the size of a minnow in England, and had 2 breast fins very strong. We often found him in places quite dry, where may be he had been left by the tide. Upon seeing us he immediately fled from us, leaping as nimbly as a frog by the help of his breast fins. Nor did he seem to prefer water to land, for if seen in the water he often leapt out and proceeded upon dry land, and where the water was filled with small stones standing above its surface, would leap from stone to stone rather than go into the water. In this manner I observed several pass over puddles of water and proceed on the other side, leaping as before. In the afternoon we went ashore on the opposite side of the bay. The productions were much like those on the side we were on in the morn, but if anything the soil was rather better. And neither morning nor evening were there any traces of inhabitants ever having been there, except that here and there trees had been burnt down. 1770 May 30. Went again ashore in the same place as yesterday. In attempting to penetrate farther into the country, it was necessary to pass a swamp covered with mangrove trees. This we attempted cheerfully, though the mud under them was mid-leg deep. Yet before we had got halfway over, we heartily repented of our undertaking. So entangled were the arched branches of those trees that we were continually stooping and often slipping off from their slimy roots on which we stepped. We resolved, however, not to retreat, and in about an hour accomplished our walk of about 1/4 of a mile. Beyond this we found a place where had been 4 small fires. Near them were fish bones, shells, etc., that there had been roasted, and grass laid together upon which 4 or 5 people had slept, as I guessed, about a fortnight before. Several of our people were ashore on liberty. One of these saw a small pool of standing water, which he judged to contain about a ton. Our second lieutenant saw also a little laying in the bottom of a gully, near which were the tracks of a large animal of the deer or guanaco kind. He who has been in Port Desire, on the coast of South America, seemed inclined to think them like the latter. Some bustards were also seen, but none were shot. Great plenty, however, of the beautiful lorikeets, seen in the last but one anchoring place, were seen and killed. The second lieutenant and 1 more man, who were in very different places, declared that they heard the voices of Indians near them, but neither saw the people. The country in general appeared barren and very sandy. Most of the trees were gum trees, but they seemed not inclined to yield their gum. I saw only 1 tree which did. It was most destitute of fresh water. Probably that was the reason why so few inhabitants were seen. It seemed to be subject to a severe rainy season, so at least we judged by the deep gullies, which we saw had been plainly washed down from the hills of a small height. Whether the sea was more fruitful than the land, we had not an opportunity to try. It did not seem to promise much, as we with our hooks and lines could catch nothing, nor were there any quantity of oysters upon the shore. The tide rose very much. How high was not measured, but I think I may venture to guess not less at spring tides than 18 or 20 feet, perhaps much more. The captain and Dr. Solander went today to examine the bottom of the inlet, which appeared to go very far inland. They found it to increase in its width the farther they went into it, and concluded from that, and some other circumstances, that it was a channel which went through to the sea again. They saw 2 men who followed the boat along the shore a good way, but the tide running briskly in their favour, they did not choose to stop for them. At a distance from them, far up the inlet, they saw a large smoke. At night they returned, and having found neither fresh water nor any other refreshment, it was resolved to leave this place tomorrow morn. 1770, May 31. Went out this morn. The weather misty and rainy and fresh breeze. As we had found by experience that many sands and shoals lay off the coast, a boat was sent ahead. At noon she made a signal for shoal water, on which we came to an anchor. The boats sounded and found a passage, on which we proceeded, and at night came to an anchor under the shelter of an island, in the midst of innumerable islands, rocks, and shoals. End of section 38, part 2 of May, 1770.